Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, efforts to keep the world's nuclear arsenal in check hit snags with the DPRK's persistent nuclear tests and uncertainty over the Iran nuclear deal. And what works and what doesn't in a new shared economy. We take a look at why some like Airbnb make money while others bite the dust. And we begin our program today with rising concerns over nuclear proliferation. Chinese President Xi Jinping talked over the phone with his American counterpart Donald Trump and also German Chancellor Angela Merkel about the DPRK's nuclear ambitions. After Pyongyang's most recent nuclear test, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also said that sanctions and pressure are only half of the strategy to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. The other half is dialogue and negotiation. Also, U.S. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley is painting the scenario in the case that the U.S. does back away from the landmark 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. So how would the international community deal with this dilemma? Take a look at this first.
Uncertainty grips the United States' nuclear deal with Iran. The U.S., Russia, Britain, China, France, and Germany all signed the nuclear deal with Iran in 2015. Under the deal, Iran agreed to roll back its pursuit of nuclear weapons in exchange for billions of dollars in sanctions relief. However, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, says Iran has violated terms of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
Let's just say that the agreement falls short of what was promised. We were promised an end to the Iranian nuclear program. What emerged was not an end, but a pause. Iran has been caught in multiple violations over the past year and a half.
Visibility to troop levels.
This appears to put Haley at odds with U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who had argued that despite imperfections, the deal offers benefits including a reprieve from the imminent threat of an Iranian bomb and solidarity with European and Asian allies. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani said the country has complied and would never breach the deal. Coincidentally, the DPRK apparently tested a hydrogen bomb just before the BRICS summit in China. The UN Security Council has held an emergency meeting to discuss the escalating tension. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said Thursday that China would support United Nations taking more measures against the DPRK.
We believe that sanctions and pressure are only half of the key to resolving the issue. The other half is dialogue and negotiation.
In a phone call with U.S. President Donald Trump Wednesday, Chinese President Xi Jinping said China remains firm in its commitments to resolve the issue through talks leading to a peaceful settlement. The DPRK's nuclear ambitions have come to a head with the recent test. Coupled with the possibility the U.S. could back away from the landmark 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, how could the international community pull back nuclear proliferation?
So what is the latest on the Korean Peninsula and the reactions from all sides? To find out, we have in our studio Beijing, we have Mr. Zhao Tong, who is an associate in the Carnegie's nuclear policy program based at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Welcome to our program. I know you're very busy these days, so it's such a pleasure to have you here in our studio. In Tehran, we have Mohammad Marandi, who is a professor and also Dean of World Faculty Studies at the University of Tehran, joining us from Iran. Welcome, Professor. Also in Washington, D.C., United States, we invited Dario Kimball, the Executive Director of the Arms Control Association. Gentlemen, welcome to the three of you. I want to start with you, Mr. Kimball. After the talk with Chinese President Xi Jinping on the phone, do you think President Trump has realized the realities of the issue on the ground here?
Well, I think it's very important for the United States and China to coordinate their approach. As President Xi and the Chinese diplomats have said, we need a coordinated approach involving sanctions pressure, but also engagement. And the United States has a very good approach that's similar to China's on paper, but the execution of the U.S. approach has been different. The U.S. has been emphasizing the pressure. There has not been sufficient engagement. I think this is a crucial time for President Xi to help persuade President Trump that in order to leverage the power of the sanctions, there needs to be effective sustained diplomacy with
Right.
North Korea designed to halt their further testing and eventually talk about denuclearization.
Mr. Zhao, of course, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also said, talking on the sideline, meeting his foreign counterpart, the half of the key is, let's just say, sanctions and other measures to be taken immediately. But he said the other half of the key is really dialogue and negotiations. But it seems that the United States have also been talking about half. For example, Ambassador Haley from the United States to the UN talking about half measures of diplomatic measures have to be finished. It has to exhaust all, as she said, the diplomatic means. How would you compare the ways of expressing things, and how is that reflecting the different views?
I think that really reflects the deep gap between the positions of Washington and Beijing. Washington really emphasizes on more coercive measures on North Korea, but China emphasizes on positive inducement for North Korea to come into the negotiating table. I've been observing the domestic discussions in the United States. I think the U.S. is still very reluctant to accept the reality that North Korea already obtained a credible nuclear capability. I think China has been trying very hard to persuade the United States to be more realistic, but so far has failed in most cases. But North Korea has been very successful to push and force United States to face the reality. If we compare the previous American positions to now, the American positions have greatly softened because North Korea has demonstrated greater and better capabilities. So I think after a little while, maybe U.S. ultimately will be persuaded by North Korea's increasing capabilities.
But at the same time, Mr. Zhao, before I go to the other guests, you also noticed that the Chinese President Xi Jinping on the phone talking to Angela Merkel, certainly a European leader, and both sides agree dialogue and negotiation is the way to go. And of course, both agree on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Why is China working so hard on different kinds of players? Is Europe and other players in the world also important in this regard, Mr. Zhao?
Yes, absolutely. The United States doesn't have the leverage over North Korea. It has to rely on other international players. And the EU is a very important player. EU has some diplomatic and economic relations with North Korea, and the EU has expressed interest in helping in playing a greater role in resolving the North Korean crisis.
I see.
And also EU played a very important role in the Iranian case. So I think it's very good to help EU's assistance in this case.
I see. Talking about Iranian case, let's invite in our conversation Professor Morandi coming from Iran. Of course, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations has been talking about U.S. possibility to withdraw from that earlier deal with Iran on the nuclear issue. I just wondered, how do you look at those remarks? And at this critical point, how should we understand the psychologies behind these kind of remarks? Professor Morandi.
Well, in Iran, I think the view is that the United States is looking increasingly unreliable. After Iran agreed with the P5+1 over the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, under Obama, the United States violated the agreement repeatedly, such as when it passed and when Obama signed the Iran Sanctions Act, as well as the visa restriction law. But under Trump, the United States has gone even further, such as when we saw the recent sanctions that have been passed by Congress and the Senate and signed by the President. But now this current administration is threatening to go a step forward and to actually withdraw from the agreement. I think it would probably hurt the United States much more than it would hurt Iran, because the international community, many powers, have invested a lot in this agreement, and the U.S. withdrawal would not only isolate the United States, but also I think it would be a sign to other countries that doing deals with the United States is not a very good idea.
I see. Mr. Kimball, help us to understand the internal debate going on in Washington. You are there. We saw you right in front of the White House right now. You know, there are different factors and forces discussing, debating among one another about what to do. And obviously, if Iran deal is, let's just say, partly destroyed, and DPRK already developed its nuclear capabilities as it has already done, What kind of directions are we seeing from the current White House in terms of what to deal with the nuclearization in this region and beyond?
Well, in my view, as an organization that supported the Iran nuclear deal, that supports a solution, a peaceful solution to the North Korea crisis, in our view, it makes very little sense for the Trump administration to take steps that undermine the Iran nuclear deal, especially at a time when we have this urgent crisis on the Korean Peninsula. There is a debate going on here in Washington on Capitol Hill about whether the Trump administration should decertify Iran's compliance with the Iran deal under U.S. law. There are many Republicans who are reluctant to go along with this. If he does this, and it would be in about a month he's got to make this decision, this would put the ball in Congress's court to decide whether to reimpose nuclear-related sanctions on Iran. I think that would be a grave mistake. Iran has met its nuclear-related obligations according to the U.S. intelligence community, according to the IAEA.
Okay.
We need to make sure that Iran continues to cooperate, but this is not a decision that Trump has yet made. It's still being debated here in Washington.
Right. When you look at the realities, the DPRK has already got several things. According to their ambassador, even to the United Nations, they have the hydrogen bomb, they have the nuclear bomb, and they also have the ICBM. That has already become part of the fact. Let's take a look at some of the timelines, how things have been happening, and how the United States has been refusing to see the reality. DPRK already conducted 6 nuclear tests, all of which have been in the same underground site in the DPRK Northeast. The earliest test occurred in 2006 with a yield of 0.5 kilotons. This was followed by a 7 kiloton bomb test in 2009, and 11 kiloton bomb was tested 2013. 2016, DPRK tested a bomb with a yield of 17 kiloton, the equivalent of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in World War II. That bomb tested earlier this month had a yield of 120 kilotons, 8 times the strength of the Hiroshima bomb, not to mention the ICBM, the length of it that it could reach. So I want to come back to you again, Mr. Kimball. This is a reality now. Okay? This is just something people have to realize. This is the reality. Facing this reality, there are 2 choices. One is to have negotiations and talk. The other is just to look around as if the white elephant in the room is not there. So what's likely to happen? How do you think Washington will be able to streamline its system and come up with something sensible?
Well, I think leaders here in Washington, the American public, really do recognize North Korea's dangerous additional tests,
but what about reaction?
Nuclear and missile progress. Well, as I said, on paper, the United States has an approach that's actually very similar to South Korea's and China's. The problem right now is the coordination of these policies, the orchestration of the diplomacy. As we've just discussed, there is a difference in the way in which this is being implemented and expressed from Washington and Beijing. The key now, and President Xi is important, President Moon Jae-in is very important, Donald Trump is crucial. They need to get their lines straight, their heads together. I think there does need to be some additional sanctions. I don't agree with all the steps the U.S. is proposing, but some additional sanctions are useful. But the key is to provide an offer of direct negotiations with Pyongyang. The United States has to have something to put on the table in exchange for a halt to the North Korean nuclear and missile testing.
Is there something to put on the table, Mr. Kimball, because you've been working on this for decades about this DPRK issue? Is there something from the United States that can be put on the table? What do you think North Korea can be able to put on the table? I'm going to have your view very briefly before I go to the other guests.
Well, I do think that China's basic proposal, the freeze for freeze proposal, is a good place to start. We need to have the United States and South Korea think about modifying those military exercises in ways that make them less threatening to North Korea. North Korea needs to halt its nuclear and missile testing. That's the start.
Mr. Zhao, at this point, we see sanctions earlier being exercised, threatened to be exercised, actually, toward China and other countries who are dealing with the DPRK in any trade deals coming from the United States, according to President Trump. And then we also see that so far there's only sanctions at least in public information. We didn't hear anything about possibility of talks, even on the sideline. So, Mr. Zhao, will you only exercise and we see the sticks without the carrots? Can things work out? And can China's double suspension proposal, together with Russia, be able to work? Mr. Zhao.
I think if we can learn anything from the Iran nuclear case, the lesson is simply by using sticks wouldn't force the other side to negotiate. At the same time, you have to offer some carrots. In the Iranian case, the U.S. offered to lift some economic sanctions that greatly helped to encourage the Iranians to come to negotiating table. But in the North Korean case, the U.S. hasn't had any idea what it can offer on the table. Rather than doubling down on sanctions, rather than further threatening to cut off the entire crude oil supply to North Korea, I think the U.S. should seriously consider putting some positive inducement in front of North Korea.
Ambiguity, of course, we understand, can be a very strategic way of doing things at this point. We understand that. But Professor Morandi, when President Trump saying whether there is going to be any military actions or things like that, he responded, we'll have to see, let's see, something like that. Would that be able to help the international community come up with some kinds of consensus? What is your view, given Iran's experiences?
No, I don't think it helps at all. In fact, of course, I have to point out that one key difference between Iran and North Korea is that Iran's nuclear program was always peaceful. The Americans were making allegations. The North Koreans made a nuclear weapon. But the United States repeatedly threatened Iran, but it made no difference. At the end of the day, it was the Americans who sent a message through Oman that we will agree to accept Iran's right to enrich uranium. And after that, the negotiations began. But I think the problem with the United States in general is an issue of credibility. When the United States invades countries like Iraq, destroys the country, when it invades countries like Libya, or it helps to destroy it along with NATO, and when it also helps extremist groups in Syria and so on to overthrow governments, this causes countries like North Korea, I would assume, to be more concerned about their own safety. The regime in North Korea looks at these past experiences, both under Bush and Obama, and they look at the language being used by Trump, and they come to the conclusion that the only way to make sure that the United States does not invade their country or destroy their country is to have that sort of nuclear option. So when the United States makes these sort of threats, I think it creates an incentive for the North Koreans to move more towards military capability. And on the other hand, when we look at the past of the United States, I think it only pushes it further. And when the United States does not abide by international agreements and pulls out of international agreements, whether it's the Iranian nuclear deal or the Paris Accord or anything else, that makes countries, which would include North Korea, be more wary of anything that comes out of Washington.
I see. Mr. Zhao, here's the thing. Now, THAAD system being deployed, 4 more launchers, according to the latest news, additional to the earlier 2. You also see cries in some sectors of the Japanese and the South Korean society talking about we need nuclear weapons too. Are we seeing already an arms race in reality going on in Northeast Asia? And who should be responsible for this if things are getting out of control? China is in the region, United States is out of region, but if there is something going on, nobody is going to be the winner. So here's the thing, what to do now for China? When you look at the situation, you are not the major player because it is United States and DPRK, and yet China in the very middle of it. Mr. Zhao.
Yes, so basically there are 2 options. One is to use military option to deal with the North Korean crisis once and for all. Second is to talk. But the U.S. has been reluctant to take any option, so it becomes a de facto 3rd option, which is to wait out. Hopefully that time will resolve the crisis in one way or another.
But how? The fact is, nobody knows how.
Right. The fact is, if we wait, we only see North Korea developing better capabilities, and that has broader regional implications. So we're already seeing arms race happening, South Korea, Japan taking increasing measures to develop both defensive and offensive military capability, and Russia and China are reacting very strongly. So it is creating a bigger problem among the regional countries. It's harder to maintain stability among the regional countries. I don't think China can do much in resolving this dilemma. I only hope U.S. can be willing to engage with North Korea, because that's really the key to resolve the root cause of the problem.
Okay, before we go, very briefly from you, Mr. Kimball, is this what the United States wants to see? Arms race in Northeast Asia? A North Korea developing nuclear weapon, ICBM, nobody now is being able to contain it. What can the U.S. do? Once again, I want to throw that question to you very briefly from you, sir.
Well, the United States has an important responsibility because its ally, South Korea, is being directly threatened by the North. But this is a global problem. Let's be careful not to try to shift responsibility to one country. China has an important role to play here, I think a greater role than it has played in the past. Japan and South Korea and China and the United States need to be on the same page to prevent further North Korean developments and an arms race in the region. So I've outlined before what the strategy is, and I would encourage President Xi, President Trump to work better together for that balanced pressure and engagement approach.
All right. The cycle of action-reaction should come to a stop. We should really come out with some real measures to deal with the crisis. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. The three of you, Zhao Tong, Mohammed Marandi, Dario Kimball. Really appreciate it. Thank you. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing. Still to come on our program. Why do some shared economy ventures succeed while others have floundered? We talk to an executive of home-sharing platform Airbnb and check the pulse of China's shared economy right after this break. Yes, you're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing. Airbnb is an online marketplace that links apartments with prospective guests. The business began in the year 2008 when two roommates wanted to profit off their vacant living room. The company now boasts 3 million listings in 191 countries. It also is notable for adapting well to the shared economy, being valued at $31 billion US. Meanwhile, ride-hailing company Uber reported, though, of a $3 billion loss in the year 2016. So the question really is, how can some weather the new business landscape while others failed? And what is going to be the environment for China when it comes to shared economy? And now we are joined by Chris Lehane, who is the Vice President of Airbnb in charge of Global Policy and Public Affairs. What a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be here. I've heard so much about you.
Oh, thank you,
the most influential journalist, not only in China, but in the world. It's a real honor to be here.
You have also done really influential things, from political consultant for the Democratic Party to now executive of an online portal.
Yes.
What do you make of this transition? Why that jump?
Yeah, there's a couple reasons. I spent a big chunk of my life working in the Democratic Party, which focuses on helping everyday families. That's something I really, really care about. And this is a platform that's based on a community where most of the economics that are generated actually go to the people on the ground. Another big reason, and I know this is something that you've often talked about, which is, particularly in the US, it's become harder and harder to actually do stuff in government. And this is a platform that's global, 191 countries, 65,000 cities. We have 250 million people who've used the platform. And so you have an ability to actually do some stuff, and it's really global in its impact. And so for me, it's a really unique opportunity. We're also, we're here in China, right? This is a place that is living in the future in many regards about how you're thinking about issues. And for me, this was an opportunity to work with a company and a platform that also is very much focused on the future.
Airbnb has been winning a lot of eyeballs, particularly recently with the debate that you created about trying to get rid of any so-called white supremacist from the list that could use your service. But there are a lot of controversy involved. For example, how would you define a person? And what standards are you using? Whether businesses should be about politics. and who is going to be further categorized in the future by Airbnb. So can you explain?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this took place recently in Charlottesville, Virginia, where there was a gathering of folks who had so-called fascist views. And you know, we have a policy on our platform where if you're going to be on the Airbnb platform, you basically have to agree to a set of standards and values. And at the heart of that is this idea that anyone can belong anywhere, that you embrace people regardless of what their background is. Ultimately, our vision and our mission is to help people belong anywhere globally. And when you are someone who doesn't reflect that particular philosophy or value, you've had to make a commitment to agree to that, to be on the platform. And you know, we took action because there were people on who were trying to come on the platform who did not subscribe to that perspective, those values.
But people would say these are PR stunts because it's very hard for you to judge a person, and particularly if you don't know private information related to them. So are you really using private information that you got hold of as a business to go against your customer?
No, the information we use is information that's accessible and available publicly. And so the people that we banned from the listing in Charlottesville were people who had publicly expressed themselves and issued views that were filled with hate, filled with vitriol, filled with discriminatory perspectives. And for us, that violated the terms of our service, the values that we represent as a platform. You're absolutely right.
Are business going to be political in the future?
Well, you know, it's
because
interesting.
If you ban those people, there could be the entity that they run that would ban you and some of the others, or the other way around, many other possibilities.
It's a great question, and it's one of the interesting issues when you have a platform that's of this size, 250 million people. It may not be the size of China, but it's bigger than some countries in the world if you think about it in that way. And because these platforms are so global, governments are increasingly looking for us to work with them, right, to promote partnerships and to promote policies that are consistent with their perspectives. And so platforms, I think, increasingly are going to be asked to play more of a role, but as partners and in support of some of the policies that governments are looking at.
But of course, that's a tricky question too, because should platforms be asked to fulfill all these obligations? We see earlier debate about Facebook, for example, their way of doing their business and covering the news. And now with Airbnb, you know, one of the things is you have to work with legislations that designed locally, but at the same time, there could be new legislations coming out anytime regarding have an impact on your business. So what are you going to do with this? And what is going to be your relations with the governments in which country you're operating?
So we made a commitment called the Airbnb Policy Compact back in the fall of 2015, where at the core of that commitment was that we were going to work in partnership with governments. I think we may have a little bit of a different perspective.
What is the definition of this partnership?
So when every government can be a little bit different. One of the things we have found is that every country, every city can be a little bit different, a little bit unique. And so as a platform, we've made the commitment to work with those governments, whether it's the national level, sometimes the state or province level, or the local level, can be different depending on where you are in the world. But to understand that we need to work in partnership with them because the platforms are so big and frankly have a lot of power, but we do live in societies that are controlled and run by governments, and it's really important for us to work to complement the direction that the government wants to go in.
But you also said there are bottom lines that you have set out for your own business as well. So what if there are sometimes in conflict or not necessarily in the same tune? What are you going to do?
So I think what we certainly look for is we have an overarching values perspective, right? And that value perspective is that anyone should be able to belong anywhere, right? And that is what the platform is about. Within that, right, we want to work with governments as partners to make sure that what this new thing is working as well as possible in those particular parts of the world. Again, I think our perspective may be a little bit different than some of the other platform companies. We do believe that platforms have a responsibility to actually affirmatively work with governments. In many respects, what home sharing is not necessarily new. Home sharing over a digital platform is new. And so you need new rules for the new thing. When you went from a horse and buggy to the car, right, you needed new rules for the car. New speeding rules, new roads, new rules of the road. Same type of thing with home sharing. But to make that work, there has to be a partnership with governments. Governments are ultimately responsible for writing the rules, for enforcing the rules, But we can help governments by giving them the tools that they need to be able to enforce and be able to make sure that platforms like ours are working as well as possible for their particular society.
Chris Lehane, we're going to continue our discussion about this, particularly how it's operating in different countries and what kinds of prosperity are we seeing for shared economy.
Sure.
But first, let's take a look at this.
The concept of the shared economy may not have been born in China, but is surely taking off here. Although bikes are nothing new, the operating model of bike sharing has combined satellite navigation systems, mobile payment, big data, and other advanced technologies to make something original. Now bike sharing has become the most visible venture of the shared economy. It also extends to ride-hailing, smart cars, basketballs, and even umbrellas. This innovation has not only changed the lives of the Chinese, but people all over the world. So far, the two biggest bike-sharing apps, Ofo and Mobike, have expanded to the US, the UK, Japan, Thailand, Singapore, Austria, and Italy. But the shared economy in China is in its infancy, compared to the decade of experience of rental online platform Airbnb.
We have now Christopher Lehane, who is the Airbnb Global VP, and also Jay Huang, the former Intel executive and also founder of J Venture. Of course, earlier, Chris told his story. That's an interesting case study of Airbnb. That's one of the, I guess, shared economy business models worked. But many business models does not work, Jay. I'm not looking at you to ask for the failure stories. but you know what? A lot of great ideas, and yet how come it didn't work on a business basis? Jay?
I think China is quite different, and because China first developed so fast, and some of the things and then are quite different compared to the United States or Western Europe. Compared to your business, for example, I look at the housing, for example, in China, their quality is quite different, and they have a better one that can be as good as the best houses in the United States, but some of them may not be that advanced. So in the U.S., and because I'm also the customer of the Airbnb,
he's a visionary.
Yeah.
Pledge of allegiance already happening over here on air.
So why use Airbnb?
But I hope you could be fair this time.
Okay.
Please.
Yeah. So I use the Airbnb overseas, for example. I more or less know what I'm going to get, so kind of expected. In China, and may or may not be expected, may have some surprises, for example.
Well, isn't that the beautiful thing about life? Chris, what is the cheapest and the most expensive Airbnb you have ever stayed? Which one is fun?
I've stayed in a tree house.
Okay.
You can actually stay. I haven't done this, but you can stay in an igloo if you want.
Okay.
You can also stay in a castle if you're interested in any number of places, including Count Dracula's castle, if that's of interest to you. And about a month ago, we actually worked with the country of Sweden to have the entire countryside of Sweden made available over the platform.
Talking the power of these kind of new creatures.
Well, what it really was designed was to drive tourism, right, to a particular...
That's true. Yep. But on the other hand, you think about the competition going on in these markets. China already, you have already some established players in the market. So for you, shared economy business model from other places, will that work in China?
Yeah, so we have a very specific strategy here in China. It began, and in some ways, Jay actually alluded to it and is an example of it, which is we really wanted to focus on what's called outbound travel, people traveling from China to different international markets. And we've had about 4.96 million people travel in the last year.
You got that number right.
That's a big number. But what has happened as a result of that is that people come back, and they themselves then want to become hosts. And so we've sort of seen this organic growth in China. And over the last year, we now have 120,000 listings that are active. And by active, I mean they're actually people coming and staying in those places on a regular basis here in China. And so over the last year, we saw about 2.25 million people come in on the platform and travel around in China. And I think where this ultimately goes inside China is, about 87% of the travel in China takes place domestically, right, within the country. The biggest single travel activity in all of humanity is during the Chinese New Year. 61 million people travel over those 40 days.
But they don't stay in Airbnb. They stay at home. That's the point.
But they're staying in people's homes.
Yes, at their own homes, mainly their parents. But one of the things is, still, this is the reality.
Yeah.
You see, the Chinese local players are rising. And will you have an opportunity? And the window opportunity usually, you know this, Jay, is very short.
Yes.
So whether you jump or you don't, if you jump, you really have to put a lot of resources.
Really important for us is that we engage as partners here in China. We want to be very humble, we want to be very respectful.
Yeah.
Secondly, this outbound travel is generating an enormous consumer base. This is a technical term, but what platforms like ours are really two-sided networks.
That's right.
You both need the outbound and the inbound. We don't necessarily, nor are we looking to own or be the biggest player in China, right? Domestically, we just need to have a core focus, and I think we are well on our way to there. And the third point, and I think this third point is really important, almost all the money, this I do think distinguishes us from some of the other tech companies that you were referencing, almost all of the money being generated on the Airbnb platform in China stays in China.
You see a trend, Jay, that is growing here in the emerging economies, in the developing countries, that people travel outside and they are also willing to take in people from elsewhere in the world. This is a growing process we're talking about. How much of these kind of shared economies, whether it's a hotel, it's a room, or it's a car, or maybe in the future a plane, actually would help this trend to spread? I think this is a revolution that we are talking about here. Jay?
I agree with you. I think this is something really new, and it looks like they are very strong, and the growth is pretty wide. We see a lot of shared economy ideas, and some of them may or may not work. Some of them are quite bold. For example, people are talking about shared girlfriend and boyfriend.
Oh,
for
that's
example.
maybe not the best
Shared
way to
pets,
do.
shared basketball, shared umbrellas.
That's right.
That such reflects and the people's enthusiastic about this new ideas. I think that's fundamentally look at the shared economy is utilize some idle capacity.
Yeah.
Overall, that's a help for the whole society, and also make more efficient. For us to utilize
Idle
the resources.
capacity and also pain points. That's what
That's
we're
right.
talking about. But, you know, Chris, emerging economies
Yep.
are keep on playing a bigger role, even though some of their economies are suffering with a slower growth.
Yep.
We just had the BRICS summit earlier in China. But you do see this consumerism
Yep.
rising in those countries. What do you make of this trend, and what would that mean for shared economies, for you and others as well?
I think what's really interesting is that I do believe, and I've traveled all over the world, that China is actually becoming a model in terms of embracing where the world is going. The Chinese government put out a white paper earlier, really looking at how the sharing economy can help move people forward. And if you look at some of the underlying stats, it's phenomenal. 40% year-over-year growth in the sharing economy. 600 million people in China engage in the sharing economy either as a user or as a participant in some form or fashion. Could be as much as 20% of the GDP by 2020, 25% by 2025, and so growing incredibly fast. But I think that is a function of the fact that China does live in the future in many respects, and I think the Chinese government has taken a look at this economy and does see the people-to-people economics that can be generated by using things such as an underutilized asset, someone's home or a car, or what I'm going to be doing later today, which is going through Tiananmen Square in one of the yellow bikes that exist here in Beijing, which I've seen all over. And you know, we have data from our own survey work that shows that 97% of the people in China actually like the concept of a sharing economy. So I think there's something magical going on here between the government's vision and the culture here of really embracing it. And so I travel all over the world, and when you come here, there's a certain energy for talking about this, but also a certain energy for engaging.
But when you think about the business models and also the growth stage, development stage of these emerging economies, China included, which you talk about, are they going to likely transform the culture of the shared economy? Shared economies, mainly, many of them started up in the United States, but the business model shared all over the world. So how is that likely to change the overall process of future growth of the shared economy? I think that's an interesting, very interesting question, Chris.
Well, I think in like so many other areas, I think China is going to end up being an enormous lever in all of this just because of the pure market size that exists here, coupled with the fact, like in so many other things, whether it's mobile payments, or countless other examples.
It's just like wildfire
I mean,
all
for
over
me,
China
right, I'm
now.
an American. I was talking earlier. I came here in 1998, and Beijing looked one way. Today, you come here, Beijing is completely different in terms of the growth, the vertical growth of the buildings. It's an amazing speed in terms of what has taken place here. But you look here in China, in a generation, you've gone effectively from primarily an agricultural economy into a digital economy.
That's right.
In less than a generation.
Yeah, but what
took the West 200 years to do that.
But what would these kind of things mean, the speed mean for changing the culture of the shared economies? What opportunities will this kind of speed represent to you? I think that is an interesting question. Jay?
I think you're absolutely right. I think the shared economy requires the users and also suppliers and then not abuse the system.
Yeah.
So that is a very good and for the culture and the moral. And practice, and then I think that have a factor of improving those standards.
Very interesting. We're going to discuss, of course, in the future some of the questions you just raised. But for now, I want to thank both of you, Chris Lehane and Jay Huang. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insights CGTN in your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.